Now that we've established our definition of psychology and talked about a couple of our basic terms and concepts that we need to get started, let's take a step back and actually look at the history of psychology as a field. Now, you might remember that I mentioned psychology is a very recent field on paper, but there is a long, long history of psychology-like ideas that led to the formation of the field of psychology. So we're going to start long before psychology was a separate standalone field, and we're going to look at our early history, where we consider philosophers and physiologists as sort of our precursors to what we now think of as psychology. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle have been asking questions about the mind centuries and centuries ago, and physiologists and physicians such as Al-Majousi have been looking at the anatomy of the brain. And Al-Majousi was actually one of the first physicians who tried to explain psychological disorders, or what we now describe as psychological disorders, as illnesses as early as 900 AD. So this idea of trying to study our behavior and our physical body and how it connected to our mind has very distant roots. And it actually leads us to one of the first major problems that we encounter in psychology. And this is called the mind-body problem. And this problem basically says, if we're looking at behavior and the mind, as is our definition for psychology, how can we try and study something as immaterial and unobservable as the mind? So the body and our behavior is pretty easy to score. You can observe somebody and what actions they do. You can measure things like temperature and blood pressure and so on. But how do you quantify thoughts and feelings? How do we get at that? And because psychology is specifically looking at behavior and the mind, that's a big portion of psychology that would be completely unobservable if we didn't have some kind of workaround. So our mind-body problem is our first problem that needs to be overcome before psychology can be a field. So we're looking at what is this relationship between our body and the behavior that it produces and that abstract mind. The first of the perspectives that we're going to talk about in terms of this mind-body problem is the concept of mind-body dualism, or sometimes just called dualism. And so this perspective says that the mind and the body are two separate entities. So they focus on the fact that the body is something physical and observable, whereas the mind is something abstract, immaterial, and therefore unstudyable. So our big name for dualism is René Descartes. And he was a French philosopher and mathematician who was actually known for inventing analytic geometry. So he joined the field of geometry and algebra, but also philosophized about the nature of the mind and the body, which is why we're talking about him here. So Descartes' argument was that if the mind is inherently immaterial, it's intangible, it would therefore be unknowable. And so he had this idea that no matter how much we study the physical body, the nature of this immaterial mind means that we can never provide information about that mind. So studying the body is pointless because it will never give us what we need to know about the mind, so why try? Now, this is a fairly problematic viewpoint when it comes to psychology because half of psychology is that studying of the mind. So this doesn't really work well for us. And that's why we focus on our next perspective, which arose in contrast to dualism. And this is the concept of monism. As you'll begin to see as we work through this chapter, as one perspective arises, so as dualism arises, we seem to come across another contrary or opposite perspective that's inevitably going to arise to argue against the first perspective. So because of the existence of dualism, we then see the rapid rise of monism, which stands in contrast to that viewpoint. So monism is the belief that the mind and body are one. So the mind is not a separate spiritual entity. It's the same basic thing as the body. And as an extension of this, because the mind is an extension of the body and is the same basic concept, then we can learn about the mind by studying the body. So our famous figure here is Thomas Hobbes, who proposed that mental events, things like thoughts and emotions, are actually just a product of physical events. Now, the way that I've had this best explained to me to have this concept sink in, is to think of our mind sort of like the weather. So you can talk to someone about weather, and you can say, oh, it's sunny today, or it's going to rain on the weekend. So there's a concept of weather, but we can't point to a single entity and say that is weather. There isn't a concrete, solid thing that is weather. Weather exists in different groups, but it's mostly just our interpretation of what the conditions are outside. And in the same way, the mind is kind of like our interpretation of what's going on internally. So our thoughts and feelings and emotions are all coming from physical events like neurons firing in our brain. So in this way, the mind isn't a physical separate entity. Instead, the mind is just our way of describing what's going on in our brain. So it isn't that the mind is something separate, it's just a descriptor of what is physically happening within our bodies. Now, this perspective is a really important idea for psychology because it tells us that our concept of mind can, in fact, be studied by measuring the physical processes that are going on within the body. Now, while this was a good idea or a good progression for us getting to psychology, because it's telling us that yes, we can learn about the mind by studying the body, we still had a little bit of a problem. And that was the fact that both monism and dualism were more theoretical, philosophical debates as opposed to actual guidelines on how we should proceed with studying the mind. And that brings us to our next concept, which is the perspective of British empiricism. Now, this is going to be important because it'll actually lead us into a couple of our future topics. But British empiricism was established on the thought that all of our ideas and knowledge are gained empirically, meaning that we gain them through our senses. So we've already seen this world empirical, or at least the same root, when we were talking about science and the scientific method. So these British empiricists were focusing not so much on theorizing and reasoning, as we saw in the earlier perspectives, but now they're focusing more on observation and trying to have a more scientific and objective view of how the mind might function. So they would say that observation is far more valid than the pure reason that was used in the earlier perspective, because reason has the potential for error. So sitting around and thinking about how our minds might work is a lot less useful in their perspective than actually observing what the mind can do. So here, John Locke said that philosophy, because remember, psychology doesn't exist yet, philosophy should focus on the capabilities and the extent of the human mind, as opposed to just the nature of the human mind. And this push for a more scientific perspective helped lead us into our actual first establishment of psychology. So we're going to look at the first psychology lab ever established. And so this brings us to Wilhelm Wundt, who is heralded as the father of modern psychology. So he established the first psychology lab at the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1879. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but there are a lot of sort of names and dates being brought up in this lecture. And I include these because it helps some individuals keep things chronologically ordered. However, when I ask questions, because I've mentioned that I like to test on things that are more application-based, things that are more on how you can apply and understand concepts, So for our midterms, I tend not to ask questions like, who was Wundt? Instead, I might say that Wundt, who established the first psychology lab, he had this concept. What would that apply to this situation, or how would that apply to this situation? So in my questions, when I introduce a name, I don't use it as sort of the only thing that you have to remember. I'll also include maybe what perspective Wundt was part of and ask you about what that perspective might think of a situation or something like that. And that's because I find that it's very easy to have to memorize names or dates, but it isn't very useful. In practice, I'd much rather you understand the perspectives that these individuals were associated with and how those perspectives apply to other situations. So you'll get to see some examples of the kinds of questions that I like to ask as I move through the content. So I like to give you a feel for what's important. And so this is just meant to say, don't spend a lot of time trying to memorize names and dates, because I'd much rather you focus on the concepts that are essential for these topics instead. All right, so back to Wundt after that little aside. So Wundt's focus was trying to use scientific techniques to study the mind. He really wanted to make psychology an independent and separate discipline. So he wanted psychology to be the equivalent of biology or chemistry or physics. He wanted a standalone hard science that used a lot of scientific techniques and got away from those more reasoning and philosophical debates that had come earlier. And Wundt's perspective and Wundt's drive is seen all across North America today, because the graduates that came out of Wundt's lab set up new labs all across Europe and North America. So he and his students were responsible for an explosion of psychology all across North America. And here we have a map. This is more just for interest's sake, but you can see in the first 10 years how many psychology labs were established across North America. So we have one here in Canada. So the University of Toronto got their first psychology lab in 1891. But there are 23 different laboratories established in North America in 10 years. So there was a massive explosion of psychology. So I guess when it finally kicked off, it started with a bang. Now, when psychology started out as its independent field, there were two major perspectives on how the science should be approached. So there are two major schools of thought at the very beginning regarding the science of psychology. So they were debating how psychology should move forward. And so we have our structuralists, people who believed in structuralism. So they wanted to break down consciousness into its elementary components. And on the other side, we had our functionalists who believed in functionalism and wanted to look at the function or purpose of the mind. And so we're going to talk about each of these two conflicting schools of thought and see how they pushed the field of psychology forward. So starting with our structuralists, this is where Wundt started. So our initial establisher of the psychology lab, he and many of his students were of the idea that we should study the mind in terms of its basic elements. So they wanted to break consciousness down into its simplest structural components. So they used a technique called introspection. And introspection just means to look within. And they would look within and describe their own experiences. So they would keep a detailed record of everything that they experienced, focusing in on sensations. And they would keep detailed records of the sensations, the feelings, the thoughts that they had, and they considered those sensations to be the most basic elements of consciousness. Now, from our modern perspective, this concept of introspection sounds a little bit unscientific, but the way that they went about it, the detailed records that they kept, and their focus on trying to document everything that was happening left an important mark on the field of psychology by establishing a scientific tradition for actually studying those cognitive processes that were going on. So even though structuralism died out fairly quickly in the field of psychology, it did get us moving in the right direction, and it did get us starting to think more scientifically and to do less of that reasoning or thinking about thinking, and start moving towards scientific stuff. And so, of course, that brings us to our contrasting school of thought, which is functionalism. And so our big names here are the Jameses. So William James and James Roland Agnell. And they focused on investigating the function or the purpose of consciousness. So rather than trying to break consciousness down into its most basic building blocks, they would instead focus on asking questions like, what does the mind do? What is its purpose? What is it capable of? They figured that our structuralists had completely missed the point. The structure of the mind is irrelevant. What we should care about is what it does, how it works, the function of the mind. And our functionalists were strongly influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. They stressed the importance of adaptation in helping an organism survive and reproduce. So they would look at the different things that our mind is capable of doing, things like processing information or evaluating threats, and they'd consider that in terms of how those abilities might make us survive longer, might help us to find mates to reproduce, how that might lead to evolution. And so this focus on adaptations pushed us again into more of a scientific perspective, where we're considering the function or the purpose of what the mind was doing and how it might have evolved into being in its current state. And so if we're looking at this contrast between structuralism and functionalism, some people might ask which school won in this perspective off. And today, honestly, psychologists aren't really categorized as either structuralists or functionalists. There were pros and cons of each of those perspectives. As we said, with our structuralists, that concept of introspection wasn't very scientific because it was more thought-based, and it didn't really allow for an objective evaluation of what they were claiming to have observed. However, it did set up an idea of keeping detailed records and pushing for more scientific and systemic approaches. So a little bit of structuralist ideas have persevered. And in contrast, our functionalists have still continued onward, though their ideas have evolved and changed and are now more a part of existing fields like applied psychology or even behaviorism, which we'll talk about as our next topic in just a moment. But those are fields that have sort of taken what started as functionalist perspectives and have changed them and made them more useful as time goes on.